Let's bring in CNN national security analyst Alex Pleitsis. Alex is also the director of the Atlantic Council's Counterterrorism Project. We're just learning, Alex, that only one single vessel crossed the Strait of Hormuz on the Oman side yesterday. What does that tell you about the current state of affairs between the U.S., Iran, and really the rest of the world that relies on this critical waterway?
It tells us that we still have a critical disagreement between the United States and Iran, and it is in fact over control of the Strait of Hormuz. And I'm told by Qatari officials that are traveling to the region now and other regional mediators that that remains the heart of the problem here. And that's that the Iranians believe that they have the right to control the strait and that any vessels that are outside of it are subject to action, whereas the United States has made it quite clear the expectation is freedom of movement.
Iran's slain supreme leader amidst all of this was buried in his hometown early this morning, local time, and even amid the massive funeral processions, we never saw his son, the new Ayatollah, Mujtaba Khamenei. What do you make of that, and what sort of impact might his absence have on Iran's domestic affairs?
So the assessment of multiple intelligence services, both from our European allies and folks in the Gulf, as well as U.S. officials I've spoken to, is that Mujtaba Khamenei is in fact running day-to-day government and making senior decisions. But he was kept away from funeral processions here and proceedings, one out of security, but also because he was severely disfigured, is what we're hearing, during some of the attacks that took place early on, particularly the opening strike in which he was present that killed his father and other members of his family. Potentially having a prosthetic, having allegedly had multiple surgeries on one of his arms, and potentially pretty severe burns to his face. So between the injuries and the security risk, there was a decision made for him not to attend.
At the same time, two Israeli sources are now telling CNN the Trump administration does not, repeat, not want Israel involved in the fighting with Iran over concerns of losing control of the conflict. Do you suspect that assessment is correct? And if so, why would that be the case?
So the Israeli government has made it quite clear that they would like to see this war fought to its conclusion, and they feel that the only way this will ever really come to an end is with regime change in Iran. However, that would take a significant number of ground forces and an effort that the U.S. is not willing to make at this point. And the president's made it clear that he would prefer to finish this through a negotiation. So there's a concern that if another round of fighting is sparked, if the Iranians were to strike Israel and Israel strikes back and they strike back harder, this could escalate back into a full-blown conflict, and the U.S. is trying to contain that and close this out through negotiation. So very delicate balancing act at the moment.
Let's turn to this latest reporting that we're getting from our Pamela Brown and Kevin Liptak, sources telling them that Israel recently shared intelligence with the U.S. that Iran had recently devised a new plan to try to assassinate President Trump. How do you suspect the U.S. is evaluating this information against the fact that Israel seems to have very different objectives in the short term from the U.S. in the war with Iran? Could this be an effort by Israel to try to influence U.S. decision-making?
I mean, it's certainly possible that it's an effort, but to present false evidence that was easily discernible as not being credible would be catastrophic to a relationship, given the significance of the allegations that are being made. So I suspect this is true at this point, and no reason not to believe so until we hear otherwise. And unfortunately, this does follow a pattern of behavior from the Iranians over the last decade or so, where they have attempted to actively target former U.S. officials, including President Trump, after he ordered the assassination of the late Iranian IRGC commander, Qasem Soleimani, in Iraq. And so since then, they've engaged a number of plots for hire, murder for hire, essentially, where they've hired thugs in the U.S., for lack of a better term, to try to assassinate people. Fortunately, they've been disrupted, but they haven't stopped plotting since.
Yeah, I remember a few years ago when there was a plot by the Iranians to try to assassinate the then Saudi ambassador to the United States, who was having dinner at a very popular restaurant in Georgetown, Cafe Milano. And a lot of us have eaten there, and it was a very, very scary moment indeed. Fortunately, the ambassador was not killed. What's your understanding of how the U.S. military changes its plans when it comes to international conflicts based on what are described as real-time security information provided by the U.S. Secret Service?
So in that particular case, this information came in, although the plot details are not clear. While the president was abroad, he was obviously in Turkey at the NATO summit. As we saw early in the conflict, I think you and I were actually on air during that day when they fired, the Iranians fired a couple of missiles towards Turkey, where we have Incirlik Air Force Base, and Turkey chose not to invoke Article 5, so there was no NATO response. But that was clear at that point that he was at least within range of Iranian missiles, and just given the severity of the threat and the fact that they made him use one of the older Air Force Ones, it kind of gives the implication that the current new aircraft that was gifted by the Qataris is missing some sort of countermeasure or protective mechanism that the older aircraft have while they're still retrofitting. And so a decision was made to switch the aircraft out. And then the U.S. military would provide whatever additional security assets were necessary to protect the president based on that threat and whatever the Secret Service determined to be credible at that point.
Important information. Alex Plitsis, thank you very, very much for your expertise.